There is a specific type of attention women give men that feels like interest but functions as something else entirely. And most men never learn to tell the difference until years have already passed. You think you're reading engagement. You think you're reading attraction. You think the conversation, the laughter, the time spent together means what you've been taught it means. But there is a category of interaction that mimics all of those things without carrying any of the intent you believe is attached to them. And by the time you understand what was actually happening, the dynamic has already shaped years of your behavior, your expectations, and your assessment of your own value. This is not about rejection. Rejection is clear. Rejection ends things. This is about something more expensive. This is about sustained ambiguity that men interpret as potential, when in reality, it was never unclear on her side at all. She always knew. You're the one who didn't. The psychological cost is not the loss of the relationship. The cost is the slow realization that you were operating inside a framework that didn't exist. You were solving for variables that were never in the equation. And because the signals looked identical to the ones you'd been told to watch for, you kept investing, kept interpreting, kept believing that clarity was just one more conversation away. But it was never coming, because there was nothing to clarify. The role you occupied was already defined. You just weren't told what it was. This happens to men across every demographic. Age doesn't protect you. Experience doesn't protect you. Intelligence doesn't protect you. Because the conditioning runs deeper than logic. You've been taught that if a woman spends time with you, listens to you, responds warmly, laughs at what you say, seeks you out, that those behaviors mean something is building. And in some cases, they do. But in others, those exact same behaviors mean she has placed you in a category where attraction will never exist, but your presence still serves a function. That function is not sexual. It's not romantic. But it is real. And because it's real, the interaction continues. The attention continues. The warmth continues. And you continue believing you're reading the situation correctly because everything you were told to look for is present. Except the one thing that actually matters. And that one thing will never arrive. Men are taught to look for green lights. But they are almost never taught to recognize the difference between a green light and a light that stays yellow forever. The yellow doesn't turn red. It doesn't turn green. It just stays yellow. And you sit there waiting, believing that any moment now it's going to change. Because that's what lights do. They change. But some don't. Some are designed to keep you waiting, not because anyone is cruel, not because there's malice, but because the system benefits from your waiting. It benefits from your presence. It benefits from your attention, your emotional availability, your time, your validation. And as long as you're waiting, those benefits continue. The damage is not that you were rejected. The damage is that you were never in the category where rejection or acceptance was even on the table, and the signals never told you that. The signals told you to stay, to keep trying, to be patient, to prove yourself, to demonstrate value, and you did all of that. And it didn't matter, because none of it was ever going to matter. This is the part men don't talk about. The part where you realize that all the effort you spent analyzing her words, her tone, her body language, the timing of her texts, whether she touched your arm, whether she laughed a certain way, all of it was irrelevant, because the conclusion was already determined. You were trying to pass a test you'd already failed before you walked into the room. And no amount of correct answers was going to change that. The psychological weight comes from the fact that you can't identify the moment it was decided. You replay everything, searching for the point where it went wrong, where you misstepped, where you could have done something differently. But there is no moment, because it was never in motion. You were operating under the belief that there was a dynamic unfolding, a possibility alive between you. But it was only alive for you. For her, it was already settled. And everything that happened after that was just you moving through a space that had already been defined without your input. This is what breaks men. Not the loss. The irrelevance of the effort. The fact that everything you thought you were doing, everything you thought mattered, didn't even register in the framework she was operating within. You thought you were a participant. You were actually scenery. And here's the part that makes it worse. She didn't lie to you. She didn't mislead you. She didn't pretend. From her perspective, everything was clear. The way she treated you, the way she spoke to you, the attention she gave you, all of it was consistent with the role you occupied. The problem is that you didn't know what that role was. You thought you were in one category. She knew you were in another. And because she knew, she had no reason to clarify. Clarification only happens when there's confusion. From her side, there was none. So the conversations continued. The interactions continued. The time spent together continued. And every piece of it reinforced your belief that something was developing. Because how could it not be? How could someone invest this much time, this much attention, this much warmth, if there wasn't something there? But investment doesn't mean the same thing to everyone. The time she spent with you was real. The attention was real. But the meaning you assigned to it was yours, not hers. She was spending time with someone she valued in a specific way. You were spending time with someone you believed you had a chance with. Two completely different motivations. Same behavior. And because the behavior matched, you never questioned the motivation. Men make this mistake because they've been taught that attention equals interest. That time spent equals investment. That warmth equals attraction. And in many cases that's true, but in others, it's not. And the signals for both look identical. So you're left guessing. And most men guess wrong. Not because they're stupid, but because the cost of guessing wrong when it's actually interest is enormous. So they err on the side of belief. They stay in. They keep trying. They wait. And the waiting becomes the relationship. Not a romantic one. Not a sexual one. But a relationship nonetheless. One where your role is fixed, your function is clear, and your belief that it could become something else is the only thing keeping you there. Remove that belief, and you leave. But as long as the belief remains, you stay. And she has no reason to remove it, because your presence while you still believe is more useful than your absence once you know. This is not a conspiracy. This is not strategy. This is just incentive structure. If telling you clearly means you leave, and leaving means losing what you provide, then clarity has a cost. And if ambiguity keeps you present without that cost, then ambiguity becomes the default, not because anyone planned it, but because it works. And it works for years, sometimes decades. You look back and realize that the dynamic you thought was building towards something was actually complete from the beginning. It was never incomplete. You just didn't know what the finished version looked like. You thought there were more chapters. There weren't. The book was done. You were just rereading the same page over and over, believing it was progress. The men who recognize this early protect themselves. The men who recognize it late do not. And most men recognize it late, because recognizing it requires you to accept that you were wrong about something fundamental. That your ability to read interest, to assess attraction, to identify where you stand, was not just slightly off. It was inverted. You thought you were somewhere you weren't. And the evidence you used to confirm you were right was actually evidence that you were wrong. That's the inversion men don't expect. They expect that if they're wrong, the signals will be absent. But sometimes the signals are present, and you're still wrong. Because the signals don't mean what you think they mean. They mean something else. Something that serves a different function. And you're reading them through a framework that doesn't apply. This is why men feel blindsided. They point to the evidence, the time, the attention, the laughter, the conversations, the emotional depth, and they say, how could all of that mean nothing? And the answer is, it didn't mean nothing. It just didn't mean what you thought it meant. It meant she valued you in a way that had nothing to do with attraction. And because you couldn't conceive of that category existing, you never looked for it. You kept operating inside the only framework you knew, and that framework was wrong. The bitterness comes later. Not at her, at yourself. For not seeing it, for believing for so long, for investing so much into a conclusion that was never available. And the worst part is that you can't even be angry at her, because from her perspective, she didn't do anything wrong. She spent time with someone she cared about. She was warm, engaged, present. She just wasn't attracted to you. And she didn't think she had to say that out loud, because in her mind, it was already obvious. But it wasn't obvious to you, because the behaviors looked the same. The time looked the same. The attention looked the same. And you'd been taught that those things mean something specific. So when they appeared, you believed what you'd been taught, and you were wrong. This pattern repeats across millions of men. Different contexts, same structure. They meet someone. They feel a connection. They interpret warmth as interest. They invest time, emotion, energy. They wait for the moment it turns into something more. And the moment never comes. But the interaction continues, so they keep waiting. They recalibrate their expectations. They tell themselves it's a slow build, that she's cautious, that she needs time. And they give her time, and more time. And eventually they realize that time was never the variable. The conclusion was already set, and all the time in the world wasn't going to change it. But by then, years have passed, and those years were spent in a framework that didn't exist. You shaped your behavior around someone who was never going to see you the way you needed to be seen. You made decisions based on a future that was never coming. You held space for a possibility that was only possible in your mind. And when you finally see it, the question isn't what went wrong. The question is how you didn't see it sooner. How all the signs you thought were pointing towards something were actually pointing away from it. How your interpretation of every interaction was backwards. How you spent years believing you were getting closer when the distance was fixed from the beginning. This is what men don't prepare for. The possibility that they're not just being told no, but that they were never even being considered, that the question was never open, that their effort, their patience, their presence, all of it was spent inside a dynamic where the outcome was already decided, and they were the only one who didn't know. And the cruelty is not that it happened. The cruelty is that it felt like something else the entire time. It felt like potential. It felt like progress. It felt like if you just did a little more, understood a little better, waited a little longer, it would turn into what you believed it could be. But it was never going to turn into that, because it was never that to begin with. Some men figure this out in months. Some take years. Some take decades. And some never figure it out at all. They just keep waiting, keep reinterpreting, keep believing that the next conversation, the next interaction, the next shared moment will be the one where it shifts. But it never shifts, because there's nothing to shift. The category was set, and you can't change a category from the inside. The ones who realize it eventually pull back, and when they do, they notice something. The dynamic doesn't fall apart, it adjusts. She reaches out less, but not in a way that suggests loss, just recalibration, because what you provided is still useful, it's just not essential. And once you're gone, the role gets filled by someone else. Because the role was never about you, it was about the function, and functions are transferable. That's the part that stays with you. The replaceability. The understanding that everything you thought was personal, specific, unique to the connection between you, was actually structural. You were occupying a space, and when you left, the space remained. and someone else stepped into it, and the dynamic continued as if you were never there. This is the signal men misread most. They think their presence is personal. They think the time spent together, the attention given, the warmth shared, is about them. And sometimes it is, but other times it's about what they provide. And the distinction between those two things is invisible until you're already deep inside the wrong one. You can't identify it from behavior. You can't identify it from tone. You can't identify it from time invested or emotional depth. All of those things exist in both categories. You wait, and the waiting becomes the answer. By the time you understand what was happening, the cost is already paid. The years are gone. The energy is spent. The belief that you were building towards something has been replaced by the knowledge that you were maintaining something that was never going to grow. And you can't get those years back. You can't uninvest the emotion. You can't undo the decisions you made while operating inside a reality that wasn't real. This is the tax men pay for misreading signals. Not just the loss of the relationship, but the loss of time inside a framework that didn't exist. The opportunity cost of what you could have been doing, who you could have been investing in, if you'd known sooner that this was never going to become what you thought it was. And the knowledge doesn't make you smarter, it makes you colder. Because now you question everything, every warm interaction, every invested conversation, every moment that feels like connection. You ask yourself, is this real or am I misreading it again? And you can't tell, because the signals are the same. The behaviors are the same. The only thing that's different is your belief that you can trust your interpretation. And that belief is gone. So you pull back. You protect yourself. You stop investing until you're sure. But certainty never comes early. Certainty only comes after time. And time is the thing you can't afford to give anymore. So you're stuck. Either you invest without certainty and risk repeating the same pattern, or you withhold until you're certain and miss the opportunities that were real. Most men choose the second option. They withhold, they protect, they wait for absolute proof before they invest. And in doing so, they filter out the ambiguous situations, which means they filter out most situations, because most situations are ambiguous at the start, and the women who would have been interested lose interest during the waiting period, because they interpret your hesitation as disinterest, and they move on, so you end up in a different trap. You avoid the pain of misreading signals by refusing to read them at all, and in doing so you eliminate both the false positives and the true ones. You protect yourself from wasting time, but you also guarantee that you'll miss the moments that mattered. This is the condition most men end up in after they learn the lesson. Not wiser, just more cautious. Not better at reading signals, just more afraid of reading them wrong. And that fear doesn't make you more successful. It just makes you slower, more hesitant, more likely to let real opportunities pass because you can't distinguish them from the fake ones anymore. And there's no way out of this, because the lesson can't be unlearned. Once you know that warmth doesn't mean attraction, that time doesn't mean investment, that attention doesn't mean interest, you can't go back to believing it does. The framework is broken, and you're left navigating without one. Some men rebuild. They create new frameworks, new ways of assessing what's real, but those frameworks are guesses. Educated guesses, but guesses nonetheless. And they're wrong just as often as the old ones were. Because human behavior is not a system. It's noise. And you're trying to find patterns in noise. And sometimes you will. And sometimes you won't. And there's no way to know which is which until it's already over. This is what men face after they misread the signals. Not just the loss of what they thought they had, but the loss of the ability to trust their own perception. And that loss is permanent, because once you've been wrong about something you were certain of, certainty itself becomes suspect. And without certainty, every decision is a gamble. And most men are not comfortable gambling with something that matters. So they stop playing. They withdraw. They convince themselves they're being strategic, being smart, protecting their time and energy. But really, they're just afraid. Afraid of being wrong again. Afraid of investing again. Afraid of spending years inside another framework that doesn't exist. And that fear is rational. Because it happened before, and there's no reason it won't happen again. The signals haven't changed. Your ability to read them hasn't improved. The only thing that's changed is your willingness to trust yourself. And that willingness is gone. This is the real cost. Not the rejection, not the wasted time, but the erosion of your ability to move forward without doubt. And doubt is expensive. It slows everything down. It makes you second guess. It keeps you out of situations where you could win because you're too focused on avoiding situations where you could lose. And there's no fix for this. No reframe that makes it better. No perspective that turns it into growth. You just carry it. And it changes how you move through the world. And most men never talk about it. Because admitting you misread something this badly, for this long, feels like admitting you're not as perceptive as you thought you were. And that admission costs you something you can't afford to lose. So you stay quiet. You move more carefully. You invest less freely. And you tell yourself this is wisdom. But it's not wisdom. It's scar tissue. And scar tissue doesn't make you stronger. It just makes you less flexible. And the women who would have been right for you never know why you didn't pursue them. They just see hesitation. And hesitation reads as disinterest. So they move on. And you're left wondering if you missed something real. But you'll never know. Because you didn't test it. And you didn't test it because the last time you tested something, you found out you'd been wrong for years. This is the loop. And most men stay in it. Not because they want to, but because getting out requires risking the same pain again. And that pain was too expensive the first time. So they stay in the loop, and the loop becomes their life. And they convince themselves it's a choice. But it's not a choice. It's just what happens when you misread the signals badly enough that you stop trusting yourself to read them at all.